about the distinctions can get you any kind of semantic distinction of the kind that you need to keep expressivism a local view. And I mean, I think in some ways the dialectic goes like this. I mean, from Blackburn's point of view, it looks so obvious as an expressivist that minimalism doesn't make everything the same, because the positive things the expressivists want to say about how the vocabularies differ are all still in play. That point looks so obvious that he sort of fails to see, and got a kind of constitutional reason for, as it were, for failing to see that the kinds of distinctions that he can reconstruct can't be the semantic one. So I agree with you completely that but those are just further reasons for thinking that the Eliatic criterion isn't going to work.
We've got about 4 minutes per exchange, so Peter.
Yes, this is a question about the central argument, the application of semantic minimalism leads to a victory for global expressivism. The central argument seems to be that semantic minimalism things out the reference relations and the truth conditions. But I mean, it strikes me that's a sort of rather puzzling that expressivism, which is victorious in this sort of debate just amounts to the view that sort of discourse has truth conditions, but rather thin sort of truth conditions. That struck me that's a rather puzzling way of understanding expressivism. And so I'll just I'll just finish the point. So I was wondering actually about the characterization of kind of descriptive discourse versus kind of expressive discourse that you work with. It seems to me, here's one way of understanding that distinction, that kind of discourse is descriptive if it possesses some feature which divides states and affairs into two groups, the ones that have to be obtained for the sentences to be true and those that fail to obtain in order for it to be false. And you can imagine how it might go for kind of reference. Now that kind of characterization says that we should be descriptive about sentences just in case they have truth conditions, but neutral about how to understand truth conditions, whether they should be thin or thick truth conditions. Now that seems like quite a natural way of understanding kind of purely descriptive discourse. An expressive discourse would be kind of discourse that doesn't have truth conditions at all. And one virtue of doing it this way is that you can actually see that the issue of whether a kind of discourse is representational, is orthogonal to whether it's realist or not. When you talk about kind of descriptive discourse, you tend to conflate the issue of whether it's kind of descriptive, whether it has truth conditions, with the issue about whether you should be realist and think that the truth conditions have to be thick or robust. But it seems to me you want to leave open the possibility that it could be representations of that discourse. So you think it has truth conditions, but you don't want to believe that it has thick sort of truth conditions. So in sort of mathematical discourse, you might actually be representations about that, think it has truth conditions, but you want to say they're thin truth conditions. But you don't want to actually be a realist about the discourse and think that.
But if you're a semantic minimalist, then there's no room for the distinction between thin and thick truth conditions, because they're all thin. And so, I mean, it seems to me what being a semantic minimalist amounts to is thinking that the semantic notions don't have any interesting theoretical role to play in themselves, but any occurrence of terms like true and refers, in theory, can perhaps do a little bit of work to kind of paraphrase away, or can do this sort of explication work. So, I mean, in my view, what that means is that you give up talking about the question as to whether vocabularies are descriptive or not. So the reason in which expressivism comes out winning is that all the interesting theoretical questions left over about vocabularies in that case are the ones which expressivists were always interested in, on the kind of positive side of the expressivist story, the story where they were telling us what jobs and discourses were doing when they weren't doing descriptive jobs. But what's happened now is that as a consequence of semantic minimalism is that the negative side, the side which says that they're not descriptive, has just been dropped off. because there's no sort of theoretical vocabulary left in terms of it to say those sorts of things. But all the positive stuff is still there. And what's more, it's become global by default because, I mean, given that as it were, it's a global throwing out of the semantic vocabulary for descriptive purposes. There's
perhaps that I can actually just put my question.
I think
just very quickly.
One sentence.
Since the issue is whether you want to be a global expressivist versus a global sort of realist of representations, could you just explain what you mean by expressivism about discourse?
In this case,
about discourse?
Yeah, by expressivism I mean thinking that you can only theorize about discourses in non-semantic, non-representational terms.
Right.
So you want to be a global expressivist without falling into the homogeneity business.
Yes.
And the way to pull that rabbit out of the hat, if I understand correctly, in the absence of robust reference relations, is to say, well, the vocabulary just function in a different way in the scientific area, in the abstract area, and in the evaluative area. But it seems that when you tell the story about how each of the discourses of the three vocabularies comes to function in the way it does, surely one part of the story in the scientific case would be that the objects somehow influence us to use the vocabulary in a certain way, in a way that is not the case with the abstract vocabulary, right? The table influences me to talk about it in a way that the number 3 doesn't really influence me. Yeah, I think at some point you even use the amusing phrase quasi-object to refer to these things, but like 3. But the table is not a quasi-object; it's an object. But if you go last sentence, if you go minimalist about causation, about influence, about all these things, then you can't even make that distinction between the discourses or vocabularies that are answerable to a realm of entities or objects out there, and discourses or vocabularies that are not answerable to those quasi-objects that they have corresponding.
Okay, first of all, about whether I'm trying to pull a rabbit out of the hat, I mean, my view is that this particular rabbit is so fat that no sensible person could ever think that it could fit into the hat in the first place. And what we're appealing to is just the obvious difference to the story that a humane expressivist tells about, say, evaluative talk and causal talk. We can all see what the difference is. It's referring to different sorts of psychological states as being what's projected from the two places. So the difference is there right up front. Okay. Now, the point about the role of, I mean, one thing I didn't say, which I think is very important to say, is that, I mean, this story about the functions of discourses, I emphasize that it's, as it were, a story told from a broadly scientific and naturalistic perspective on our own linguistic practices and associated behavior. Okay, now, because, as it were, we're telling it using the sort of scientific causal vocabulary, we're going to be, there's an important kind of contrast between the story, or what looks like an important contrast between the story as we tell it about, say, the evaluative vocabulary and the story we tell it about the causal vocabulary itself. Namely, that in the case of the causal vocabulary, we're not only going to be mentioning the terms that we're talking about, like table and calls and so on, we're also going to be using those terms in the course of giving the genealogical story about, or the story about the function of the vocabulary. So the terms occur twice in the story, as it were, once when they're being used and once when they're being mentioned, whereas the evaluative ones are only mentioned. Okay, so that makes it look as if, as it were, the objects have a kind of priority, but it's a purely kind of perspectival thing, because that happens to be a story which we're telling from, as it were, using the scientific vocabulary and not using the evaluative vocabulary.
It's not because there's any kind of influence of the actual objects.
Well,